Thanks very much. It's really very nice to be here. And yeah, it's probably a good idea to come before the light changes. Small crowds, might we get a good one. I'm really happy to talk about this because, well, it's fortuitous. I didn't know that Tony Abbott was going to China and to Japan and Korea next week, but that's very good timing. But a lot of things have been happening. Let me start though by explaining the puzzle on the screen behind me. Anybody guess what it is? What it might be?
Isn't it something to do with, looks like an Indonesian
Yep. Okay. That's a good start. It's about Indonesia, in fact. So why do I have it here in a discussion about Northeast Asia? It's a painting by a friend of mine, an old friend named Carol Ruff. It's a painting about her family, which left Java after 4 generations and at least one Javanese great-grandparent, Dutch family, planter family, and they left in 1945. And they left under particularly appalling circumstances, not just the usual exit that colonists make, but this is actually a painting by Carol of her mother, who's a woman named Jan Ruff-Ahern, who you might have heard of. She lives in Adelaide. She was, at the age of 17, came out of a convent school in central Java and then was thrown into a camp, prisoner of war camp, and then into an Imperial Army, Japanese Army brothel. She was a so-called Jugoyampu, comfort woman in one horrible translation, sexual slave in the phrase that Hillary Clinton insisted that all State Department documents were used from then on a couple of years ago. She's now, sorry, I was told this the right way. Have I done it? I see. Better? Okay. Well, this weren't any slides anyway. The reason I have put this up is there are two. One is in Japan now, the issue about the history of sexual slavery during the war is on the agenda in a big way. More importantly, in fact, for us, it's on the agenda with the United States and United States alliance. It's also moved into the Japanese and Korean diaspora. Over the last 2 or 3 years in the United States, first in California and then I think in New Jersey, there have been very serious confrontations between the Korean and Japanese communities over attempts by the Korean community to establish memorials for sexual slaves in the case of the Japanese Army, but also drawing attention to the wider issue. This has now come to Australia, and were I able to do this, I would show you an article from a newspaper of suburban Sydney, from Strathfield, just the other day, where in fact there is now a very serious community confrontation between a Korean community which has a very interesting Chinese artist who's made a statue about this, and the wider Sydney Japanese community who are very upset. And this has become quite ugly. Thanks. There's Jan Ruff-Ahern, a nice woman now, just about 90 I think, who lives in Adelaide. And this is the story which is breaking now. I expect to come in the national newspapers very soon. I've talked to a couple of journalists recently. That's Jan as a young woman in Australia. But this is really something which is the way in which history keeps coming back. The more it's repressed, the more it comes up. And it's particularly coming up in the wider press in Japan at the moment, because the Abe government, led by Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in his second round on the merry-go-round, announced that he was concerned about the apology that was given back in the early 1990s by then Deputy Prime Minister Kono Yohei, who was a liberal with a small L at the time, and a very interesting guy. And he basically said this was clearly appalling. This was clearly, he didn't use the word slavery, but he came very close to it. And it was a very decent apology. It was an apology which did resonate at the time. Prime Minister Abe, in his first term in about 2006, said that he wanted to revisit the manner in which that decision to offer that apology had been given. And now he's in fact instructed his Chief Cabinet Secretary to revisit that issue. There is a big brawl going on, not just in Japan, but between Washington and Japan, about what the Chief Cabinet Secretary is actually doing. according to what he appeared to say, is we are revisiting the documents provided and the testimonies provided by Korean women about what happened to examine the validity of the decision to then make the apology. Since then, there has been huge pressure, both public and back channel, from Washington about this. You can imagine how this goes down in the United States. And so that's why I'm actually making the point that we are on the edge of this too. And I don't think Prime Minister Abbott and Foreign Minister Bishop will escape from this very easily. I'll come back to this one just a minute. Okay. First of all, what I want to talk about. As you said, I want to talk about the pivot, the American pivot to Asia. I also want to talk about the other side of the American issue at the moment, the fact they're going broke. It's technically called sequestration of the American budget, particularly the whole mixture of whether tax cuts are ongoing, hence the budget shrinking, and then simply cutting the budget per se and how that's going to impact on the military. The rise of China is behind all of this, but I particularly then want to focus on South Korea and Japan tension and what that means, both the United States, its alliances, what it means apropos China, and then what it might mean for Australia. Because this is really incredibly important, I think, for this country. And I really would not envy Prime Minister Abbott attempting to explain a number of things when he goes to Tokyo, Seoul and Beijing. The pivot, sometimes called rebalance. The idea that a line had to be drawn under the American adventures in the Middle East, pretty obviously disastrous, both strategically, politically and financially. A reorientation to what the United States has long time seen its main interest, which is in East and Southeast Asia. And the pivot, in fact, had half a dozen, if you like, aspects to it, the most important of which were military, economic and political. The military one involved rebalancing, literally, shifting more resources into the Pacific, particularly the Navy, particularly also the Marines. We know about that from Darwin, for example. Secondly, it had a political dimension, which was refreshing old alliances and building new partnerships. And that we see with Australia, we see it with Japan, we see it with Korea, very clearly in terms of allies. In terms of partnerships, the extraordinary thing is there is now a very real prospect that American ships will be home ported in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. That's an extraordinary change. Equally, more than 20 years after, the Philippine Senate decided to ask the United States to move from all its Filipino bases, then now Clark Field and Subic Bay are looking like they're going to be back in action. There's certainly some very important intelligence connections that have been made there. We also know, for example, that now there are American Navy ships home ported in Singapore. And Singapore, of course, has always been pro-American. That's obvious. Talk to the Indonesians about that. They say, oh, those Singaporeans. But they've always been very careful about how they've done it. And this is actually stepping out much more clearly with your home porting. And the last part of it is military proper, in the sense that we are seeing a lot of in Australia, which is not so much the Darwin deployments and the things that I've talked about American bases, but rather the mantra of interoperability, the presumption in which that American forces, Singaporean forces, Filipino, Australian, they will operate in the same way from the same playbook, the same rule book, and as far as possible the same technology. And that makes the prospect of what the United States calls burden sharing much more operationally possible. It also, of course, orients the smaller forces to the ways in which things are done in the larger forces more generally. The pivot's also economic. You've probably heard about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States is trying to negotiate with about a dozen countries at the same time. It's kind of difficult diplomatically, I wouldn't like to do it. But what's really important about this is that this is continuing the agenda the United States has been following economically since the end of the Cold War to open up these countries to foreign investment, to open up trade towards free trade, removing all protectionist barriers, and particularly opening up access for American intellectual property, because the United States is not building motor cars, as we know these days. It's going to make money from something else. And so, for example, in Australia, that's one of the issues that Australia has to think about very carefully in relation to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But this is another dimension of that, and it's it's really important to see the way in which the United States has pursued this systematically and energetically with a number of countries. Two standouts. One is Indonesia, and there are kind of, I think, idiosyncratic reasons for that. The other is China. China has not been invited to be a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though, of course, it is a major partner of virtually everyone else involved in that, particularly the United States. The question is, does this at all add up to anything like containment, has been suggested, the containment of China, a la the containment of the Soviet Union from 1945, 48, where we like to date it from, onwards? I don't think it does, but it certainly does mean a serious intent to constrain China and to limit its options economically, politically and strategically. And this is a serious engagement with China. I think I've said before, one of the key problems is the United States simply has not really resolved the fundamental issue at a system level. Is China to be the strategic partner of the United States or the strategic competitor? In Clinton's time, it was pretty clear. He took an awful lot of money from one direction. It was partner. When Hillary Clinton visited Beijing as Secretary of State, she would very often talk the language of cooperation. And one particular dimension, in fact, does show a great deal of cooperation between the United States and China, and that is climate change. And they're doing a lot of things together, probably more than they're doing, certainly in Australia. We don't do climate change very well here. But it's interesting. There's not a lot of conflict on that, and they're working together. They've got some real achievement runs on the board. However, when the Secretary of Defence goes to China, or countries close to China, well, the famous announcement by Leon Panetta in Singapore, we're back. And that didn't actually augur well for the notion of cooperation as far as the Chinese are concerned. And Malcolm Fraser makes the point that when he's in Beijing, the Chinese ask him, well, who are we supposed to listen to? Ms. Clinton or Mr. Panetta, or now his successor? It's not clear. And I think that actually is not just a cliche, it's telling us something serious, that the United States and China are so economically integrated that it's very difficult to resolve that question. And I think Australia needs to think very seriously about that. Moving to the beyond the United States, I'll just say something very quickly about the sequestration issue. The Republicans are right. I mean, in a way, they're behaving nastily, but the United States is, in a technical sense, close to broke. You can't run two major wars on credit cards and expect there not to be any consequences of it. And if you want to reduce taxes at the same time, as well as expanding spending, it's a problem. That's about all I could possibly agree with the Republicans about, but they're right about that issue. It's also difficult, given that Obama is now close to, I think, a lame duck president. That's a pretty extraordinary thing to say. Perhaps somebody's got 2 or 3 years to go, but he has lost extraordinary capacity in the last few years. And that's also relevant to the way that Japan, Korea and China are thinking about these issues. The sequestration itself is forcing the Department of Defence to make some fairly hard choices about what they're going to go ahead with. I'll give you one very minor example of this. It happened in Taiwan just the other day. The Taiwanese have got F-16 fighters, like the Americans. They don't have very good radar systems and avionics in them. The Americans said, okay, we're building new radars for our F-16s, so we'll sell you some at a certain price there. And then sequestration comes along and suddenly the Defence Department and the Air Force decides they can't afford themselves to buy those radars for their F-16s. Taiwan can have them, but the unit price has gone up enormously. And of course that then ramifies through. There's many other examples about this, and it's certainly going to have some connections, I think, to one end of the Marines in Darwin about what happens at the other end in Guam, because who's going to pay the bill for moving all those Marines from Guam to, from Okinawa to Guam? The Japanese may begin to limit what they're prepared to do. Let me leave that just so we can come and talk about that a bit more later on. But this issue of alliance integration has been a consistent American theme, especially since the Clinton time. It's going beyond sort of Nixon's idea of burden sharing. It is really trying to get a much higher level of operational and strategic integration between Japanese and American forces, Korean and American forces, Australian and American forces. And so we not only do joint training, we have an awful lot of people embedded, for example, with the American military now, to learn how they do things and to be involved very closely. The problem of the United States then becomes, if two of its main allies in East Asia, Korea and Japan, are barely talking to each other, what's left of that alliance integration there? And that's where things begin to get very, very difficult. I think one of the most important things, let me say something about the rise of China, and I think you can probably come and correct me on many things, but anything I say is obviously going to be cartoonish and short. I think most of you know what has happened. My way of thinking about it is that this is actually a civilizational readjustment. That if you look for most of the last 2,000-3,000 years of human history, China has pretty much been at the centre. It's certainly been at the top of most systems that we've seen. And then around about the time that Australia gets established as a European settler colony, China begins to lose power, rapidly becomes subordinated to European imperialism. Australia, in its emergence as a nation, is absolutely coincidental with that collapse of Chinese power and collapse of Chinese capacity in the world and all the psychological aspects that go with that on both sides there. That's changing very quickly. Whether China becomes the largest economy in the world in 2016, 2030, doesn't matter. You have to assume every capitalist economy that's ever existed has not grown in a straight line like that. It doesn't. The business cycle will determine that. There'll be some bumps along the way. But one way or another, China is going to become vastly more important to Australia than before. One way or another, China is going to be a genuine great power in a way there really aren't any others except the United States. I mean, nobody takes Britain seriously as a great power anymore. The French certainly take themselves seriously as a great power, but I'm not sure anyone else does. And that may be unreasonable on my part. And then there's Russia. Yeah, okay? But a great power behaves in a certain way. And I think this is the key to thinking about the question there, about what China is going to become. The whole regime transition theory about the way that rising power's got to muscle its way through the detritus, the concrete established by the hegemon. Well, that's one theory. It may or may not happen. If you talk about revisionism, the way in which rising powers are supposed to want to revise the rules of the road, George Bush did a fair bit of that, and we're paying the price in part for part of that. China is going to become a great power, and it is going to use its economic power and its military power for political ends. Does that mean Chinese expansionism? So I don't really think there's much evidence of that. I'm actually not in the school of China lovers. I'm actually a critic of China's political organisation and its repression of human rights. I certainly see China in the next 10 years and from now on, and we're seeing it already in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, it will use its military power to muscle its way in. Not necessarily by violence, but by gunboat diplomacy. And that's what we've seen in the Senkakus, and it's what the Philippines has seen in the South China Sea. What you make of that, I think you need to be very careful about. China is very clearly saying the rules that have applied since 1945, probably 1944, which allowed the American Navy to go anywhere in East Asian waters. Why should we put up with that anymore? Would the United States put up with us sailing our fleet off Los Angeles, Catalina, and going up the coast? Of course not. And this is a very, very serious Chinese position. They are now developing the technologies, possibly some problems still about training, but certainly they are beginning to get the capacity to, what the Americans say, deny access to the East China Sea and the northern part of the South China Sea. In 1996, Bill Clinton, when the Chinese were pressuring Taiwan, sailed the 7th Fleet through the Straits, the Taiwan Straits. It now could not be done without extreme anxiety. A colleague of mine was lecturing last night, an American colleague was lecturing by Skype for my nuclear weapons course, and he said the Chinese have got an awful lot of submarines. They're not very good, they're very noisy, but really only need one to get through. And that's the point if you're worrying about it, if you're an American admiral. The Americans are trying to do things about that, of course, and there are some things that they can do, and those things actually involve Australia because of the role of Pine Gap and North West Cape. But by and large, there is a new game. The Chinese have the capacity, to a certain extent, to defend those approaches to China which they never had before. I find it very hard to say that that's evil, frankly. I can't see why we do that. I don't think I like the consequences of it, but I'm not sure what we're going to say about that. Let me move from China to talk principally about two things and use two catchphrases. One that you hear in Korea a lot, which is the Abe cancer. Koreans, conservative, remember we have a very conservative president there, President Park Geun-hye, the daughter of the former dictator who was assassinated in 1979, the man who arguably did establish South Korea on the path to what is now an extraordinarily rich and powerful industrial country. In her circles, you hear that phrase, people talking about Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, in terms of this is a cancer which is rotting away at our relationship. In Japan, you hear the inverse. You hear that, oh, we're so sick of the Koreans. We've got Korea fatigue. You know, so we've got charity fatigue or something like that. We're sick of being nice to them. Everything we do doesn't satisfy them. Needless to say, the two of those attitudes together is pretty lethal. Let me give you some sense of what's now happening in Japan. Firstly, on economic issues. So, Abe is best understood as a restorationist nationalist. He is trying not just to make Japan great, he's trying to make it great in some reflection of its past image. Koizumi, the earlier Prime Minister who lasted 6 years in Japan, a long time, he was a nationalist. He wanted to make Japan great as well, but he didn't see it so much as the past. And really Abe is, calling backward look is not quite the right word. He wants to make Japan something in the image of the past. And so, two of his key themes are the war. What in Australia is called the Second World War, sometimes called the Pacific War, in his part of Japan is called the Greater East Asian War. And a reminder that there was a Greater East Asian War to liberate Asia from white colonial control. And that's something that a stream of people in the LDP, and he's probably not the most extreme in the LDP, but he certainly believes that very sincerely. Secondly, he is very concerned to remake Japan. When I might have spoken about this on another occasion here, when he launched in his first prime ministership the new Ministry of Defence from 1951, when Japan became independent, until 2005. Japan didn't have a Ministry of Defence, it had a defence agency. The name didn't matter, but the fact that it was within the Prime Minister's department, subordinated to the Prime Minister's department, bureaucratically, that made a big difference. When Abe launched it, he didn't say, as Kevin Rudd would say, this is a wonderful policy development which is going to have great effects on the modernisation of Australia, or Tony Blair saying some such thing. He said, this is laying the foundations for a new state. It's a very interesting thing to say. I mean, the rest of us kind of thought Japan was rather nice, as it is at the moment, and we got along with it very well. He's thinking differently from that. Economically, he's been very, in his second term, he's been very much emphasising we need to do things differently. We need to reinflate the economy. Sort of 10, 15 years of deflation has been disastrous. We want to get money moving again, and so there's been a change of fiscal policy. There's been an expansion of the amount of money in the economy. They were the so-called first two arrows of his policy. The third arrow was going to be restructuring of the economy. When the American trade negotiators started to look at this restructuring, they thought this is very similar to what's been going on before, the protection of agriculture and the protection of LDP constituencies in the rural areas, and not very much in the way of actual restructuring. And the problem I think, is not that Abe is stupid or anything like that, but to compare him with Koizumi Junichiro, his really most important predecessor. Koizumi was a nationalist. Obviously he wanted to rebuild the economy, and what he did was not say, well, let's not get out and reinflate the economy. He started to look at some of the blockages, and particularly the way in which his own party was in a sense representing vested interests which were blocking Japan moving. And so he took his own party on and he appealed over the heads of the party to the electorate. Abe is not doing any of that. He's doing much smaller things, and certainly if you read, well, I take my line from the Financial Times sometimes on this sort of thing. We're going to have a lot of people looking at it closely in Australia. But observers like Martin Wolf are beginning to say, well, time is running out for Japan on this approach, unless it seriously moves into restructuring of the economy. What he would mean is turning Japan into a free market economy, which in Japan is anathema to the people who have been running the Japanese economy for the last 40 years. They still believe in a state-driven economy. But we're not seeing anything either to revivify that Japan economy or to move towards a free market economy of the kind that America, Britain, Australia would like. That's one problem he's got. The second problem, though, is much more concerning to the alliance. There have been an extraordinary sequence of things that have happened. Firstly, in early February, the head of the NHK television system, the head of the ABC equivalent, but much more important than that in the Japanese context, said, look, this business about sexual slavery the Americans talking about, the jugulianfu, the comfort women, look, it wasn't very nice, but everybody does it, you know. And this was meant to be saying, one part which is true, that if you look at, for example, the Australians in Japan and the Australians when they're in New Guinea, yes, they organise brothels there. Certainly that's a common practice amongst many armies there. What, however, the so-called comfort system was about was something very, very, very different. It was slavery, and it was vile, and it was very widespread. And one of the things which has then happened was that this suggestion that the Kono apology should be revisited because, well, we're not sure that the Korean women who testified in private to the government about that, really they were telling the truth. My colleague at ANU, who some of you may know, Tessa Morris-Suzuki, who I think is just about the best Japanese historian we have in this country. Here, said, in a debate with Japanese and American colleagues, this business about re-interviewing Korean women, they've testified over and over again in Korea, to the American Congress and so on, but there's something else that we could do. If we don't really want to ask them, we can just look at the records that we have. And this is the record from early 1942 in Balikpapan in Borneo, which the Japanese Navy occupied, a document signed by one Nakasone Yasuhiro, who was then a lieutenant in the Japanese Navy, went on to be Prime Minister of Japan 3-4 times. And it's a document which explains the procedure, or explains the fact, for accounting purposes primarily, of the collection of native women for an Ianjo. Ianjo is a so-called comfort station there. There's no doubt the document has never really been suggested to be faked. This doesn't prove everything, it just says this happened. It happened, it involved recognisable people. We know this, that is there already. A couple of days later, something worse happened inside NHK. One of the Board of Governors, a man called Hyaka, said, well, I don't know why there's all this fuss and this carry on about the massacres in Nanjing, that is in the summer of 1937 when the Japanese Imperial Army moved upwards from Shanghai towards Nanjing, the Republican capital. People say 300,000 people died, some people say 100,000 people died. Doesn't matter, it didn't happen. This is, of course, there are arguments about numbers. How could there not be under those circumstances? But this was an indication of the sort of people who Abe had been appointing to major cultural institutions. So, not surprisingly, there has been an enormous reaction both in China and in Korea. The Chinese have very helpfully, in their eyes, honoured an important Korean, a man called An Jung-gyun, I think. And Mr. An was an anarchist. He'd been operating in Japan, he was a Korean. In 1909, he took the opportunity to assassinate the Japanese Governor General of Korea, a man called Ito Hirohumi, one of the people who founded Meiji Japan, first Prime Minister of Japan. And remember that the colonisation of Korea, which lasted about 40, 50 years, depending how you count it, was at least as bitter as that between England and Ireland, very deep, very racialised. So the Chinese decided to help matters along this year by opening a memorial hall to An Jung-gyu to commemorate the fact of his resistance to Japanese colonialism, which of course they also suffered from themselves. President Park Geun-hye of Korea was very happy about this. The Japanese have protested about this very, very strongly, saying this is unhelpful. And then the Chinese did something else. At the nuclear summit, or sidelines of the nuclear summit in Europe just last week, President Xi Jinping said, we are very, very concerned about suggestions that are coming from Japan that the Nanjing massacre didn't happen. This is completely wrong. If you were Japan, you probably would have been sensible to let it go. They didn't. They then protested about raising these issues in a third country, and so the whole thing continues. I don't want to go on too much about this, but just to say that from an American point of view, and I think from an Australian point of view, these issues are not just matters of culture, history past, they live on to the present. They relate, as Hillary Clinton made very clear, to wider issues alive today in terms of violence against women. And while there are subtleties about this, undoubtedly, there are many arguments about it, what is consistently the case is that the Japanese government representatives, official or unofficial, continually shoot themselves in the foot by apologising and then putting qualifications on it. We're sorry about Nanjing, but it was really only 100,000, you know that. As if that's the important thing. You know when you're given an apology and when it's real and when it's not. You don't care about the word, you know the affect there. That's what's really important, and it's really making life very difficult. The last thing I'll say is that, before I quickly illustrate, what this really means is that what the IR, international relations theorists, talk about as hegemony, which is not just dominance, the rule of the fist, but it's the rule basically of people who've been around long enough, who have enough influence over the kind of subordinate societies in the system, so that the people running those subordinate societies accept the rules of the road that you want. And of course, soft power helps that way. If you train Japanese diplomats in America, that kind of helps, that kind of thing. What's really interesting is that that system of hegemony, that acceptance that we may not like the war, but okay, we've actually then gone and done useful things out of it, made a lot of money. Japan, Korea and China are in their different ways moving back from that. I don't believe China is seeking to overturn the whole system, but they're certainly challenging some parts of it. Equally, what's happened now is we can now see that in China and Japan, the lid has been taken off Japanese nationalism, which was kept screwed down really very tight for a long time by the United States. The United States will probably win this fight, but to win this fight, when you've lost that hegemonic rule, that acceptance by the other side that, well, you've got the right to say what the rules are, you have to use raw power, you have to muscle in, and that eventually costs you down the line. For Australia, all these things are coming together. When Julie Bishop said, and Tony Abbott said, our best friend in Asia is Japan, you have to ask the question, did they not think about Korea? Our exports to Korea are very, very big. Korea is an important country in the region. What were they thinking really about how to deal with China? What is Australia really thinking about in this area? And I think that Hugh White has raised some really important issues for Australia. You've probably all read he writes many similar things every 2 weeks in the Age. But he's making a point. That's what you've got to do if you want to get heard. And he is asking people, what does Australia want? It's not just do you want America or do you want China? Which world is it going to be? And what do you want Australia to do to get there? So there have been some silly answers, for example, in that good blog run by ASPI, the Strategic Policy Institute, the Defence Department's think tank, which runs some quite good stuff. There was a rather foolish article saying, well, I think Australia could be a kind of broker between Japan and Korea. Really? We have such skills, don't we? This is silly. It's more a matter of, on that one, stay out of the way and don't aggravate them. Do we really want, as the papers tell us this morning, for Australia to have not just a relationship whereby Japan is probably our fourth most important military partner after America, Britain and New Zealand, so America basically, do we want to have a defence treaty with Japan? And do we want to have a defence treaty at this time when Japanese politics appears to be seized by this restoration nationalism? I think we should have some kind of stronger agreement with Japan, but I think now is neither the time to do that, nor do we do it without sort of knowing what the actual proposal is. I think we need to think very carefully about that. I'm going to stop there because I've talked too long, but go on for questions. I'll just take 1 minute. I do like this. There was a great achievement, Obama muscling the other day at the nuclear summit on the sideline. He got Obama. Oh, sorry. Oh, well done. Come on. Okay. You've seen that. You've seen the tricky part. He finally got Park and Abe to shake hands. gritted teeth is says nothing to it. And then that very bizarre photo afterwards with Obama looking like he's just come out of a science fiction movie. I couldn't resist that particularly.
Richard, thank you very much. Thank you. Richard, as a student of sort of Australian-China politics, perhaps I can kick off the questions if I may. My question to you, and you touched on it briefly, is will China institute a Monroe Doctrine within East Asia? And if they do institute that, what will the reaction be in the United States? Okay. And if that happens, what will the implications be for Australia?
Boy, you pick the easy ones. Sure. The problem about that one is we have history with it. Yeah, it's called Japan. So what Japan was doing from really from about 1928 or 29 onwards through to 1945 was exactly applying the Monroe Doctrine in its own area, and that's really what left the League of Nations. America's reaction is pretty sharp. First economic strangulation and then all-out war. I don't necessarily think that's the answer now. I think that China has a much more complicated environment than Japan faced at the time. China was massive but weak at the time. China has to deal with, if you think about it another way, I would do a lot of nuclear weapons. Against whom is a Chinese nuclear turret aimed? Well, one part's obviously the United States, another part's Japan, another part is its strategic partner Russia, with whom they fought quite a nice little war during the 1980s. And it's also aimed at India, with whom it has a much more fractious relationship. So for China, it's surrounded by quite powerful countries. It's also surrounded by, to its south is Southeast Asia, which is by no means united, but it has got some degree of unity which it didn't have, for example, at the end of the Vietnam War. So no, I don't think it's going to do that. However, I think it is going to want to start calling the shots much more on maritime issues. And I think one of the difficulties for Australia and the United States, more specifically the Americans obviously, is to decide, well, what really do they want to do about the South China Sea in particular? I noticed Indonesia, which has been very, not complacent, but had gone along with Chinese attitudes to the South China Sea by and large, and the way in which the Chinese have been pushing the Filipinos around in particular. They made an announcement the other day that they are putting more forces into Natuna, which is not part of the Chinese claim, it's very close to it. So I think it's going to be a balancing act. How do you persuade a country like China, and we are not going to do it, that there is more to be gained by not using more than muscle in that area. So I don't think a Monroe Doctrine, it's surrounded by countries which can push back fairly seriously, but it will insist on a capacity to influence that area. More sphere of influence, I think, is a closer way of thinking about it. Does that make sense?
Would you just enlighten us, just remind us of the Monroe Doctrine as it actually is?
Sure.
I think it's quite important to question.
You're a good teacher and I'm not. The Monroe Doctrine goes back to James Monroe, who was the President of the United States. Some of you know him.
President.
I know he's the president. One of them, anyway, one of them. And he basically established a doctrine really aimed at the European powers of the time. Of course, the European powers had intervened in the American wars of independence and the run-up to that, of saying Latin America and Central America, they're our patch. Stay away from it. And essentially that was the Monroe Doctrine, and in particular both political and military but economic influence, and that gave the United States essentially an economic hinterland of its own. That's what Japan tried to do in Manchuria and in the coast of China, and I don't think that's quite the way the world works. I don't think it's nicer now, I just mean it's probably a bit more complicated.
Yeah. Thank you. Please.
I'll give you a bit of scope. Barry Fox. Do you think the Americans, the Yankees, realise just how bankrupt they are? And why should we, Australia, be continuing to align ourselves with the United States, given that we are now so economically dependent on China? I might just say one other thing. It seems to me that the activity of the Americans, the Yankee in the last few years, reflects the fact that the Yankee is now really just a bloody nuisance.
Well, you said that one. I think your first question is a really important one. Do they realise how broke they are? and I don't think you have to be a political genius to know there is something deeply dysfunctional about American politics now, and it isn't just of the moment, it's been going on for a long time. It's going to take somebody braver than anyone who's on the political landscape at the moment to say what needs to be done. I think the answers actually are about taxes and rebuilding the infrastructure of the society and stopping the appalling drift to massive inequality, which is going to erode the society eventually, its strength. I think this is foolish. I don't see them seeing that, and this very hard to understand stuff about the Tea Party and its influence on the Republicans. These cultural shifts, this is the most technologically advanced and dependent society in the world, and you have a mass of people who don't believe in science. I mean, it's really very odd. I think it's not a simple issue. So I'm not sure how I can answer that, but there's not a lot of light on the horizon as far as I can see. Just very quickly, I think America is going to have to get used to the fact that it is not the sole superpower it was in the 1940s and 1950s. Culturally, that's very, very hard to get used to. America's not really used to negotiating with the world in that way. And in a sense, they've been let off the hook a bit by Europe. Europe hasn't turned out to be quite the Eurovision that it was supposed to be. It probably will get there. And China, I think of China as a kind of locomotive which is racing along, but a whole lot of maintenance hasn't been done lately, and so something's going to go wrong with it sooner or later. That's a pretty crummy metaphor, but I think it will. There are so many internal stresses. I don't think the Communist Party will hold it together for too long. What will come after it? Who knows? Don't know.
Sarah.
Sarah, can you put Asian values are different, and leading on from why do we want to be aligned with America? It's sort of because we have sort of Western values, which is the same. Sort of question about the Asian values, the things that we don't understand, the corruption, the sort of Confucian values are different to ours, and there's also the concept of face. How that's obviously something that makes it much harder for, say, the Chinese. They would really never say they'd give up Taiwan because it's this incredible pride with Asians that they really have to keep face.
Well, I go along with you some of the way, but I think actually it's not just Asians who've got face. We may call it something else. Not many countries like to live with egg on their face, seriously. Not many countries like to back down when they back themselves into a corner. This, I just took this snapshot of Carol Ruff's painting the other day. Sorry, it's such crummy quality, but I just realised that there's that on the left-hand side. There's it's a small card given to me by Kim Dae-jung, who I knew well before he became president. I remember the day he gave that to me, and he and his wife farewelled me and gave it, and then made sure I was all right when I walked out through the guards when they were in house arrest. And Kim Dae-jung was a remarkable man. He was Catholic in a country where that's very unusual. He was also an outspoken critic of Asian values. He said, I know about Confucianism, of course, and in fact he was a very Confucian character in many respects. But he basically made the point that the rights of individuals are also, in certain aspects, to be considered within that framework. That just because you're paternalist doesn't mean you don't care about other people. Just because you're collectivist doesn't mean you actually don't care about the people. And that calligraphy is talking about that, about humans and all people under heaven. And I think that for every Lee Kuan Yew or Muhammad Mahathir, I can then find a Kim Dae-jung, or I can find a Japanese exponent, Kono Yohei's son. Kono Taro is an extraordinary politician in Japan, Liberal Democratic Party president, free market man. He's famous in Japan for the fact that he has 3 political secretaries, one who speaks Japanese, one who speaks Korean as well as Japanese, and one who speaks Chinese as well as Japanese, making the point that Japan has to be multicultural, and it's not. So that's a very flip way of answering it, and I don't have time to, but I think actually when you look at someone like the Dalai Lama, when you look at José Ramos Horta, when you look at Aung San Suu Kyi, the values picture becomes more complicated. That's all I want to say. That there are Asian culture, but Asian cultures plural, and they are often in context within countries and between countries. That's something we should talk about further. Oh,
David, for this
Yes.
institution. I read an article the other day about the relationship between China, India, and also Pakistan. Now, the argument was, the article was about China getting the raw materials out of Afghanistan and it not having worked out very well.
Yeah.
And getting closer to India, over northeast India and over the territory in northeast India, and further away from Pakistan because of the suspicion that Pakistan was helping the Uyghurs. Could you comment on this, if it's true?
I can't comment in detail on that, but I would just make the point that Pakistan did incredibly well out of the Cold War, and it's done incredibly well out of the Afghanistan war. Their luck probably won't keep going forever in that. And if you were China, which one would you back? India or Pakistan? If you were looking for a partner. If you can settle your differences with India, then you have, what are the newsweek or something like that called? Chindia. And it's not a foolish thought. And there have been some interesting people, I don't know the details of what you're talking about, who've been exploring ways in which they are growing in slightly different ways. And that China's going to run out of labour quite quickly, because of one-child policy. And apropos Afghanistan, well, I weep for it. And I think China, yes, has done some fairly sleazy things with Afghanistan, but that's get in line there. And I think if I were Chinese, I'd be thinking about longer term things. Pakistan's been useful for a while. It may give us a warm water port. That would be very nice if we can get it. But India is the one if you could do it, that's the one you'd go for. That's all I would say.
Good.
Sure. Please, sir.
Tony Hastings, I'm a member of the Institute. Given the tensions between Japan and Korea and Japan and China, what's the status at the moment, in your view, of relations between South Korea and China?
That's a really interesting question. That's a really good one. I think under the last two presidents, particularly the last but one, President Roh, who was a sort of a leftist of a certain sort of peace movement sort, there were some really interesting developments which I think had actually started earlier, where South Korea was beginning to think of itself as a balancer between China and whatever. And that was partly geographic, but it was partly the fact there is already enormous exchange going on between China and Korea, industrially, economically. First time I was in Beijing about maybe 10 years ago, I was walking around near Tsinghua and with a Chinese friend, and I know Korea quite well from the 80s, and I said, oh, it's really feeling very nice. I'm smelling Korean food, I'm hearing Hangul, I'm hearing people talking Korean, I'm seeing Hangul on the shop front windows. I didn't know you were so close to North Koreans. And they looked at me, you really are stupid sometimes, Richard. Oh, right. And there's that there. And there have been some Korean intellectual life is really interesting, really vibrant. And so, for example, there have been some very interesting thinking from Koreans, quite different from what you get in Japan, about what an East Asian community might look like. And it certainly sees China as the centre. They say, well, duh. But they see themselves as not anti-Western. I mean, they're too close to America culturally now. There. But they don't see themselves necessarily as deeply antagonistic to China. I think one condition of that remaining so is the DPRK stays there. Because one thing that China is, there are two things China really cares about, I think, in this. One is Japan getting nuclear weapons, and the other is having an American-influenced state right on your border. That's different from them being a couple of hundred k's down the road. And so that actually makes the question of Korean unification, when it happens, sooner or later, one hopes, actually quite difficult. And that's when difficult choices come from South Korea, I think.